There's always, at any given moment, half a dozen, maybe a dozen stories that I just don't get to. You know, right now there's probably 6 stories that have been sitting there, you know, things that I know if I dig into them will be a good story, but I just don't have the time. I simply don't have the time. You know, the day-to-day stuff just consumes you. And, you know, if you're doing bigger stuff, you really have to do it in your own time. So, I mean, we might get to a point where I've got a story lead and I have a trusted network of readers that I engage with regularly. I could actually see myself farming out things to them and saying, why don't you have a look at this? Because I often get people emailing me, readers who I've dealt with on this stuff, saying, have you got anything for me to look at? You know, and you feel a bit, there's a tinge of guilt because you're essentially outsourcing sort of a version of slave labour. I mean, you're not paying them for their work, but, you know, I'm happy to live with that guilt.
Well, you have to prioritise, you know, and you have to absolutely talk to the people you're working with about what's important and what's not, and what they want and what they don't want, and what's number one and not what's number 3. And you know that involves engagement, and it involves a discipline that you know, perhaps in in the editorial world that I lived in wasn't always apparent, but it's much more needed now than it's ever been.
Your time management has to be really good, and it's quite often I find it very overwhelming that you're being pulled in so many directions. You might spend all day filing breaking news for online, and then at the end of the day have to turn around something for the paper, but then also you're being asked, what have you got for the weekend paper? What have you got for the Sunday paper? Do you have any ideas for how we can do a graphic with your story? Was there anyone that would be interviewed on camera for your story? So it used to be that you'd have all day just to think about writing a print story. Now that almost seems ridiculous. Like, I can't believe that we were afforded that luxury, that we had all day long just to write one story for the paper. So sometimes it's really overwhelming, and you just more and more have to just think more. Like, I just have to sit there for 5 minutes and think of all the different ways that story could be told, rather than just thinking about how you're going to write it for a newspaper. So yeah, you have to think, I'm about to interview this person on the phone. I should ask them, can I record this for a possible video package? Or if I'm interviewing someone about some stats, I need to ask them, is there somewhere that I could find a breakdown of those stats that we could turn into a graphic, something like that. So you just have to think a lot more.
You have to make sure you're organised with stories that need to go and stories that you have. This doesn't, you know, we're not discounting old-fashioned, good old, get out there, find a great story and write about it. That sort of journalism absolutely has its place, and that is the core of what we do and what drives us as journalists. But we still need to give people information as it happens, and quick snippets of information. So I would say that it changes our workflow in that we have to be more organised.
When I'm in Melbourne, I consciously use public transport, right? That frees me from having to do anything other than stand or sit for 15 minutes. It makes sure I get in some fresh air and have a walk. And that takes me out of the rut of sort of reading my email and sort of going through my papers and everything. And I consciously try to use that time, right, to either freewheel, smell the roses, so to speak, which is a necessary precursor, by the way, to thinking creatively, I would argue. And then I'll sort of typically have in the back of my mind a list of interesting things or questions that I need to worry away at, right? And what I've developed the habit of over the years is the ability to maintain that list. So I don't lose track of the sort of 2 or 3 things that I really need to be resolving at some point in the future.
With paywall models and with the focus now being on engagement rather than on click, it's much more complicated than that. You know, you might have a story that gets 1,000 people click on it, but they all go away after that. You might get a story that gets 500 people click on it, but they all go on to read 2 or 3 more stories after they've read that first story. The second outcome is, you need both, but the second outcome is the richer outcome, right? That's the one that ultimately should lead to more profitable businesses, you know, a higher yielding, you know, it's a sort of style of journalism. And so how do we capture what are incredibly complex paths that our users are navigating and put that down to a score for a journalist to say that your efforts yesterday were a 9 or a 10. Journalists are also, they're operating in an environment where they're incredibly time poor. They don't have time to sit there and think and understand the numbers for themselves. They just need someone to come back to them and say, this is on the right path or this is not on the right path. And then newsrooms need to develop a culture where they consider that type of information to be equal in value to any of their other experiences of how people are responding to the stories that they're telling.
Journalists are sort of uniquely productive, and we've been forced to be, by the way in which the media landscape has changed. There's no way really to cope with it other than to work harder, essentially, and to, I guess, also, at the end of the day, perhaps try and learn to turn your phone off every now and then.
So how do we find the time to innovate? Often we don't, is the reality. Often we don't. Often we just do what we've always done, me included. It's easy to sit on the outside and go, oh, why aren't they doing all these wacky things with data and what have you? When you're actually in here and you have the daily demands of news and the news cycle and the pace of it, you realise that a lot of this stuff is very difficult to actually execute. So you've got to be quite judicious about what you choose to do. There are certain stories that might lend themselves to certain types of innovation. Some stories might just be, it might actually just be more effort than it's worth. So you've got to be quite selective about what you do. I mean, not everything needs a video piece accompanying it. Not everything needs text. Not everything needs a graphic. Some things work best with just a graphic. So I just think we've got to be smart, and we shouldn't just tick boxes and say, oh, well, this story needs to have a picture, a video, text, and a graphic, because not every story needs that, and we need to actually use our time wisely.